Oh, damn. Let's start again. You should laugh after I made a joke, not before. The joke doesn't start with me starting.
Wait, no, we're just being polite to you. It's a laugh before you finish.
Oh.
On the anticipation that it's funny.
Oh, some dad jokes and you just play the nice guy, laughing.
Oh, no, they're really funny. They're really funny. What'syourdadjoke.com.
Welcome to the What's Your Baseline podcast. In this show, we talk about our experiences and lessons learned in enterprise architecture and business process management. What's Your Baseline is designed to be for everyone. Newbies who are just getting started with these topics, organizations who want to improve their EA and BPM groups and the value they get from it, as well as practitioners who want to get a different perspective and care about the discipline.
Each episode will tackle different key topics, providing context, background, best practices, and stories from the road, inviting you to learn from our challenges and successes, and demonstrating key tools to help you set up your practice and get the most out of it.
I'm your host, Roland Wolt, and I'm joined today by my co-host, JM Erlinson. Hey, JM, how are you doing today?
Not too bad, Roland. I'm having a great time. It's been a really exciting week for me, and man, I'm really happy to cap it off with a great recording with some good friends. How you been, my friend?
I'm doing absolutely well. I'm excited of recording actually the second podcast episode this week.
Oh yeah.
And I think we get some practice by now because that will be episode 29. So we're getting closer to the next milestone.
I know.
But JM, I do have a question for you because I know you're sitting in front of your computer. Which browser do you use for recording this session here?
Well, I got to tell you, I like a lot of different things, but when it comes to browsers, I'm all Google Chrome. I have my Google account. It logs me into everything I got, and it's just such an easy tool to use.
So then I have some good news for you.
Because
you're actually using an open source browser, and the topic that we have today is open source. And I'm happy to announce that we have an expert in that topic on the show, Avi Ghosh, who's working for MariaDB. Hey, Avi, how you doing?
Hi, guys. I'm wonderful. Thank you for having me on your podcast.
Welcome to the show. We're so excited to have you here. So Avi and I and Roland go way back, and we're really excited when we were talking about some topics that we thought would be interesting to our audience. I got to tell you, and I'm hoping over the course of today, open source has been a scary topic for me for a long time. And so bringing somebody in who works in that space, who really understands it, who's living and breathing it is such a powerful thing. So also, Avi is a good friend, and I'm excited to chat with him on the podcast. But I don't think our audience knows you as well as I do, Avi. So let's start off with a little bit of your bona fides. Tell us about you. Who are you? What do you do? What's your job right now?
Sure. So currently, I'm the global director of Sky Services at MariaDB that you mentioned earlier. We are an open source database company. A lot of history. There's some exciting things happening in that company's growth and just legacy. Right now we're going through a de-SPAC, so it's an exciting time to be in it. But before then, I was at Red Hat for close to a decade. I made 9 years and 8 months.
Almost.
So close, almost. But it was an amazing time. That's really where, I was like you, JM. I was kind of weary of, okay, what is this open source thing? It felt a little Kool-Aid-y to me, and almost cult-like, right? When you think about the internet fanboys, but after spending, I would say, close to going on like 11 years, a little over 11 years in that space, I've learned to embrace it, and I've learned just how important it is in terms of the technology space. But what's I guess we'll talk about this. Open source is not just reserved for a development model, right? It's a culture. It's a way of thinking, and we'll kind of explore what that is. But before then, I worked at Software AG, where you guys are. You might have heard of that company.
Where, Avi? To be very clear, where? You know,
Where?
I'm not with Software AG anymore, but we can talk about that.
That's true. That's true. But you were when I was there, and
that's true.
So was JM, and I was a web methods and Eris guy for a little bit, and then before then I worked as kind of an analyst, and primarily the common thread, the commonality through all of that is I've been a creative and a musician. I think that's where JM, you and I really I think bonded, felt kind of a kindred connection. That's kind of been the common thread across everything I do, and basically I'm looking, creativity and the ability to not be boxed in, the ability to kind of think big and explore maybe, the scenic route as opposed to the convenient route has always been something that has been part of my ethos, if you will. Yeah. And, I'm a tinkerer, right? I love building things, and I love experimenting, and I love exploring. And again, all of that kind of lends itself well to open source. And, open source has changed the way that I even think about music now, and how I release music and film. Yeah, we can kind of get into that, but it's an interesting, like I said, it's a mindset.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that's me in a nutshell. Always a technologist, a creative technologist, I would say.
We also obviously have other questions so that our audience get to know you a little bit better. Like what were your key experience and what is your bucket list and all these type of things. What do you do outside of work? Because open source might be a lifestyle, but I'm pretty sure there's some other things that you do as well.
Talk about art versus industry. That's how we first connected.
If I could put it in a nutshell, my way of making sense of life has always been my pursuit of art and music. So when I'm not sitting developing or supporting my team or more in the technologist flexing that side of my brain, I'm creating. So I did have music that I was putting out under art versus industry is my name. I hated using my name. For me, it's not about the person; it's about the way something makes you feel, right? So it's the impact that it has on you. And I feel like when you put a name to it, it becomes more about the individual more so than the experience. So I wanted to abstract myself from that, even though I did it all. That's another thing. I've been a studio rat, and I play piano and I was classically trained on cello, and I was a jazz drummer for years.
It's funny, people can't see behind you as you're talking. Behind in Avi's background is a sound screen for recording, so I can already see that he's actually sitting in his studio as we're talking these things, or these studio components around him.
Yeah.
Well, Rowan mentioned one other thing that I really want to get hit from you, which is bucket list. I know everyone has a special thing that they'd like to do before they kick it. And I'm sure you've achieved some of those things already, but what's the mountain on high for you?
I always wanted to work with Dolly Parton, and I got to do that this year. So I think that I've met that bucket list item. That was a big thing for me.
That's amazing.
That was she's a national treasure. And, she decided to get into the NFT space, and, I live in Austin. We have South by Southwest, and it was just I got the call, and I showed up. I was ready to do it. So, that was fun. I think bucket list wise, I've always wanted to make a film.
Yeah.
So, I would love to make a film using only open source technology. All open frameworks, using cameras, you've probably seen the OBF and all the various tools that are there right now. But that's a bucket list for me. I'd like to make a film where I, write the screenplay, I film it, I direct it, I produce it, I score it. Kind of want to do the whole thing. So we'll see. That I haven't done yet.
If you want to do a documentary about some poor podcasters, I would have an idea who could be your subjects,
All right.
I see, Roland. All right. I see. What's your baseline? The Roland Volt story.
The movie.
I love it.
Coming back to the topic of our show, actually,
Yes.
Avi, obviously you're well experienced in the open source space, and obviously there's a lot of misconceptions, like JM and I are on the complete opposite side of that spectrum. So I hope you can give us a little bit of your insight. But to get started, I think it's a good practice to start with some definitions. So what is open source?
Yeah, and see, I've heard so many different interpretations of it. But to me, if I had one word to describe open source, it's liberation, right? I feel very strongly about that because the idea of open source is, you have access to every component. Everyone ties it to technology, but I like to kind of abstract that away. It's basically, I view things as recipes or all the ingredients that go into making something. You have full access, full purview, full transparency of any given thing. Like it could be a product, it could be software, it could be a song, right? Something that people don't think of, and I like to use this as an example. The biggest song of I think like 2019 was a song called Old Town Road. Old Town Road, everyone's heard it. That song was actually based off a Creative Commons 9 Inch Nails song that they put out it was just a bunch of instrumentals that they put out, and basically this creative kid heard the song and put a beat on it and rapped on it, and then he didn't play anything. It was actually just a beat.
So I think you come up with two things just to hold ourselves honest, because there's obviously the four freedoms of open source, if you will, right? I think the first one that you mentioned when you said, oh, it's all out in the open. You can look at it. So when we talk about software code, the code needs to be released so that someone can review it and say, oh yeah, is that how is it done? Right. The second thing you mentioned is the legal aspect, copyright, copyleft, different forms of licensing that you have. And I think there's obviously one big one, the GPL, which I think is the big elephant in the room, but there's also others there. Can you talk a little bit about that aspect?
There are, but the one thing I would want to kind of also mention about that example that I gave is you have the ability to remix and redistribute any given work, right? So in that example of that song that became a huge hit, it wasn't his song. He took components of it, he added to it, and then he redistributed the song, and then it became his. Yeah. So that's an important aspect of what open source is.
That's the third aspect, the freedom to modify. Yes, I'm with you.
Freedom to modify.
Right.
And so in terms of licensing, when we get into licensing, it can get there's so many different types. So I would say the primary ones are, you've got the Apache license, you've got the MIT one, the GNU one that everyone's familiar with, then there's the BSD license. Those are some of the major ones, but they're the types of open source licenses which kind of lay out the parameters for which so another common misconception is just because it's open source it means it's free.
Yeah,
that's not true, right? There's a nuance to that. So there are like, as anything, there's always a little bit of fine print to it, but it really, I think, overarching, right? You mentioned a few of those pillars of open source. There's I think that the fourth one that we really need to highlight on, and this is kind of goes into the first thing I mentioned, liberation. It is an end to predatory practices. So I don't know if you both are kind of familiar with kind of what the impetus for open source kind of was. It was a guy named Richard Stallman.
Yeah,
Richard Stallman. Right. So there was a guy in the 80s. His name was Richard Stallman. and he had problems with software on his printer. And what he realized is he had the skills, he had the capabilities to fix it, to fix the code that was on his printer that wasn't working. But it was a black box from the manufacturer. You can't dismantle, you can't look at, you don't get to see how we made it, right? You're beholden. You have to go through us, or you're on your own. You don't have any permissions to modify it to, even though you know what the problem is. He realized inherently right there was a especially in a capitalist world, right? It's very, very easy for vendor lock-in. It's very, very easy for corporations, the man, if you will, to kind of have more of kind of a predatory control over anything that you use. And he did something about it, right? And that's when he came up with the GNU, the recursive acronym, not Unix, license. And he created that free operating system called GNU, which would be compatible with Unix. So it came from a necessity for there was the problem was I can't modify, I can't even look into what this software is doing to address the issue, because the company, the printer company, we won't have to name them here, would not participate, would not help, would not do anything about it. And from this idea came this community. And I think the thing that people miss about open source, which I think is the most critical aspect of the value of it, is the community aspect.
Yeah, but before we get to this, because there might be one or two listeners to this show who hasn't heard about this, but can you give some examples of open source products or projects that are household names? I mentioned the Chrome browser that JM uses, that's built on Chromium, an open source project, but I'm pretty sure there are others out there. Can you give us some ideas what software people might use?
Think of Drupal. Have you heard the story about Drupal at all?
Yep.
So Drupal is pretty much. I read some crazy stat on it. They said that it's about 9% of the World Wide Web has Drupal. FedEx, MarthaStewart.com, Bob Dylan, Grammy.com, any of those sites, right? They are all driven by Drupal. And Drupal, the story of Drupal is fascinating because it all came from a kid in his college dorm. It was a guy in his college dorm. He came up with this idea to potentially solve a problem. And before you know it, it's a worldwide, the world embraced it. It went global probably in the span of 2-3 years. And now it drives the back ends of so much of the World Wide Web. I'm trying to think of other crazy open, you have open source in pretty much anything that you use. Like you mentioned something like Chrome, right? The Chrome browser. Think about the fact that it's on our laptops, on our phones, on our tablets. It's a universal thing. All came from Chromium, right? There is, if you look at if you look at most of the tools that you use to this day, there is probably a 99.999% chance there is some sort of open source driving a component of that solution.
Yeah, it's things like, to make it very, very clear, right? In your car radio most likely uses some form of Linux kernel and whatnot. Every data center of whatever, every search engine, whatnot, uses Linux, and you work for Red Hat, which is a Linux distribution, So I think people just underestimate the distribution of open source in general, and that it's literally, like you said, in every piece of fabric that you touch in your daily life.
To me, it seems like this is kind of like the ultimate expression of the principle of the best idea wins. Instead of
Yes.
saying, I'm going to lock you into
Yes.
vendors and I'm going to build only corporate knowledge collateral, it says instead, I want global knowledge collateral. I want to build a collaborative space to create the best things that can only come from a massive amount of input from anyone, from the best ideas, and from the kind of testing and rigor that comes with a community that no company could ever truly buy.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a true meritocracy, right? And that's the importance of community. What was interesting, you mentioned Red Hat, right? The NASDAQ, the stock exchange, it runs on Red Hat, right? We one of my last things I got to kind of witness firsthand, when you think about this autonomous driving, all of the software that's they're actually bringing Kubernetes into your car, if you can believe that, and that's open source, right? The Kubernetes was they're using one of the Red Hat products, which is OpenShift, to drive some of that. But again, all of it is open source. It's crazy to think the software that's being put in enterprise, like the commercial things that we use, we all have access to. If you have a laptop, you have access to those same tools to build.
Yeah. So the question that I have now is, who's going to pay for it? Right. That's obviously, in all seriousness, it's an effort, right? Somebody spends time of their life to do this. So do they get paid? For what reasons do they do this?
I mean, if you think about it, IBM gave us $34 billion, 34 billion different reasons.
That's a lot of money.
JM, come back to the microphone, please.
It's a lot of money, but for an idea that nobody owns.
Nobody owns. It's free software.
But so what are you selling? What is worth $34 billion that you are selling? Is it the packaging of that idea? Like how is it worth $34 billion? It's free.
That's a great question, right? And I would say there is the aspect of the curation, right? You are a company like Red Hat. They look at the entire community. They look at what are the things that are trickling up to the top. They all live off of Git, right? They can see all of the commits. They can see the projects that have a lot of traction, a lot of use cases, a lot of synergy behind it. And from there, they derive, which one of those projects should we support, right? So when you talk about the monetization of it, so I mean, we talk about all the good things about open source. Yeah. And there's great things, but the cons of open source is there is a bit of a learning curve, right? There is a certain degree of technical wherewithal you need to have to really kind of get into that space. There's that kind of entry point. What's fascinating is they're teaching this stuff in high schools now in all over the world, right? So we can kind of get into more interesting things of what open source I think is going to directionally become. But what people pay for, and even at Maria right now, as we're going through a DSPAC for evaluation, like what is the worth of free software? People pay for that kind of peace of mind of support. At the end of the day, if you don't want, to worry about, your infrastructure, your production workloads, you hire a company like Red Hat, you hire, a Canonical, right? There's so many of these players out there that will provide you that support. So you don't have to necessarily know how some of that stuff works, but you know that there is a community behind it that will continue supporting it, that will continue innovating it, that, and then, when I think about what Red Hat does is they take those community projects, and what I really appreciated about them, they keep the community projects afloat. It keeps going, right? There's two variants. So, for example, when I think of the operating system, you've got Fedora, right, which consumers can use, and you've got RHEL, which the enterprise uses. when you think about it from a feature parity standpoint, the open source projects are always ahead of the curve, right? They have all of the bleeding edge things. What a company like Red Hat or a company like Canonical does is they look at that and they're like, okay, so this may be too bleeding edge. We don't know if 6 months from now people are going to care about this. So they observe, they participate, they contribute, right? And then from that, they look at, okay, so these are the things that stayed a year from now. Let's bring that into our ecosystem and provide not only the support around it, but maybe some security hardening, maybe some of those aspects of it.
And I do, and I have to admit, I used Fedora way back when, and I'm an Ubuntu user, even though that's out, as I heard nowadays. But anyways.
I'm kidding. I love it. Ubuntu's great.
Yeah, well, what they do is they provide long-term releases, right? So if you're a commercial entity and you say, hey, you switch all your PCs away from Windows to Linux or a distribution like Ubuntu, they say, okay, we're going to give you security updates and updates of the software. We guarantee it for 5 years, which is definitely longer than the lifespan of a PC. So therefore, you have some security. I think for the tinkerer and for the regular user who just wants to get another operating system, for example, it doesn't matter, right? You just update every 6 months or whatever the release cycle is.
Right. And the other thing I worry about is that these kind of projects, I'm assuming that companies help solve this, but these kind of projects can fall out of favor. And so something is a cool idea right now, and you have a global community of developers who tackle the problem, and then they think, well, we solved it. That's super cool. We have a really good solution. Then they move on, or it's no longer on vogue. And I'm assuming by having companies guarantee that software, they're the ones continuing to prop up the development against that particular project until the guaranteed life cycle is finished. Is that correct? Yeah.
That's absolutely correct. That's absolutely correct. And that gives companies that peace of mind to migrate, right, from maybe a closed system to an open source system, because that's a migration effort, right? It's not it's not an upgrade, right? It's a bit of, you have to start thinking of, my bread and butter for a long time was I used to be the consultant. So I used to take things that were historically on like WebLogic or WebSphere, right? And bring them over to something like JBoss EAP. Free. It was Wildfly. Anybody could do it. But we're talking big Fortune 10, 50, Fortune 100 retail companies that were taking things from these closed systems and moving their entire e-commerce platforms to something like an open source platform like EAP that I was mentioning. That takes effort because you have to go and, when you think of all those runtime, you have to go and literally change runtimes and references and a lot of that proprietary stuff. Nobody knows what the direct open variant with that, version of that would be. So that's what I would do. I would focus in on that. So companies need that peace of mind. They need to know.
So just to be very, very clear, and as you might hear, I'm all pro open source, but just to have it said, Avi, why should companies care? Right? What are the benefits? What's in it for them? If you're whatever, what's your baseline consulting? Right? If JM and I had those ideas, why should we go open source versus we just throw our money all behind Microsoft and call it a day?
Yeah, I mean that I feel like that's the decision point a lot of senior leaders are faced with, right? Do we take on some of that innovation in house, or do we outsource that to a certain degree to a Microsoft or whatever, where it's not our problem. And it really, for me to just state open source is the only way is, I don't think that would be a genuine way to present it. I think there is a certain persona, certain profile of company that really fit well into the paradigm of open source, because it is a culture, right? And that's what I keep going. It isn't a we're just changing our development model. It's really a way of thinking that needs to change and that needs to be embraced. But what you'll find is most people that are in the enterprise, they want flexibility. They want the ability to try and experiment and tinker. Most technologists get into this space because they want to mess with the cool new thing. Guess what? When you're using something that is closed, the ability for you to experiment and innovate is significantly constrained by what you have the permission to do, right? When you embrace sort of the open culture, when I think of it from just from an innovation standpoint, if you want to be an innovation company, you have no choice, in my opinion, but to move towards the open source model, because people need to break things. People need to dismantle things to see how they work, to rebuild it and make it better. You can't do that if you're in a closed ecosystem.
Yeah, I hear you. But it also might be a function of age. I was actually a contributor to the Drupal project that you mentioned before. I did some translations and all those things.
Really?
Yeah. Can't code, but speaks two languages is a perfect skill, for this. But now when I look at what we do here, it's WordPress, because that's the biggest thing. And I just want to have a convenient content management to use, don't want to fiddle with it. So that's also, even though WordPress is also open source, but it is how much product do you want versus how much tinkering do you want? But to come to this, what are typically the main questions that you hear pro or con open source?
Yeah, I think the biggest one that I hear is, how can it be secure if everyone has access to it? Right?
Honestly, that's a big fear of mine too, because then everyone sees the code, and vulnerabilities are normally camouflaged through code obfuscation, right?
Sure. Well, to a certain degree, but so think about it this way. Would you, if you face a security issue and a closed solution, you have no idea, right? You have to just put full trust into entity that you're giving your data and control over to, that they have your best interest in mind. You have no way to validate it. You have no way to verify. You just have to believe. You just have to believe. And let's just say we've had a few credit agencies lose all our data. We've had a few retailers. I don't know about you, but I get constant notices. A password I changed 2 days ago showed up on the dark web, and I get a notice on my app. I'm like, wait a minute, what? So, to just if you're the type of person that just believes what you're told, and maybe there's a cynical, age-jaded side of me here showing, I like to validate. I like to verify, and I think that's what makes, in my opinion, open source more secure, because everybody can see how this works. Everybody knows the entry point. Everybody knows what they need to address to kind of plug all the holes.
And people are connected to each other. There's dependencies between the different projects, and obviously you want to stay in good standing with your peers, right?
Yes.
And I think the idea of having 1,000 eyeballs looking at that, and in that scenario, if your project is dependent on something else and that something else has security issue, well, guess what? You will put some peer pressure on your upstream project, right? And you will tell them, guys, you need to do something. We found something. And I think that's the cultural aspect there. But we're going to talk about the personal side of open source in the next segment. The one thing that I have right now is actually more a question around ownership. You said it's free, but if you do something as an organization, you enhance it, you put in your trade secrets, if you will. How does that work in open source?
Well, I mean, as long as it's a open source solution, right? You have access to the source code. The source code is always available to you. Anything that we do, you have the source code available to you.
So if I take your software and I add something on top of it, right, and it's licensed by the GPL or one of those others, just to be very clear, I need to make my contribution also open source. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Really?
You do.
That's crazy. That means that I guess you're giving away, but you're getting in return. Like, it's one of those things where a company is paying people to work for the company. And during that time, they are putting money into something that is not owned by the company. That's I now understand. It's a company shift. The culture has to embrace that the idea is independent of the company.
Yes. But there's a little nuance to that scenario that Roland mentioned as well. Now, if, let's say, you build upon you took an open source project, you added things to it, you repurposed it, renamed it, changed some things around, and you want to profit off of that. You have to keep the open source. You have to be transparent about how the open source components played into that, but you as a vendor can decide to sell it. You can repurpose it and make money off of it, but you have to look at kind of the and this is where it kind of gets into the fine print, right? You have to really look at the components of that project, what things you're allowed, right, to profit off of. In GNU or the GPL stuff, you're normally fine. But when you get into some of the Apache, some of the FreeBSD, there's a little bit of technical fine print that you do have to be familiar with. So just keep that in mind.
And just to be very, very clear, you obviously could build a product that's partially comprised of open source and partially comprised of your own proprietary whatever stuff, and you package it together. So I've seen that in organizations where we included Apache as the web server for our product. We obviously made the Apache code available or linked to that page, and we're very clear. Okay, our web server runs on Apache, right? So you can do that too.
That's awesome.
Roland, you mentioned a key thing there, right? You still have to keep those open source components transparent, right? The closed stuff is fine, right? You don't have to necessarily expose that unless you want to convert it into a community project or you want other contributors. Then you have to also include that as part of your open source license.
Fantastic discussion. I'm really enjoying it. We're going to take a bit of a break here, just a small break to play some music, as we love to do on the show. Yeah. And during that time, we'd like you to think about the software that you work with, the things you interact in your daily life, the stuff that you work with in your organization. How much of that is vendor locked? Think about it, really, truly. How much of that is stuck into a vendor, and what of that software would you want to change if you had the choice? If you could go and make modifications to that source code, how would you think it would affect you? And how much is it open source, and how well is open source actually working for you and making things happen? So we'll leave you for a second and come back with our second section, the how.
Welcome back. This was awesome, Avi. Learning about the why and what open source is and how it's applied in organizations and the pros and cons. This is all great stuff. And I hope everybody who listened until now is now convinced to have a second or third or deeper look on open source. But there's one question that really nags me, because we spoke briefly about this in the first segment, who's going to make money out of it, who pays for it, and all these things. But I would love to know, if I was a regular dude who's interested in that, and the question is, why should I contribute? What is in it for me?
It really depends on your persona, right? And if you're talking about it from a pure developer standpoint, it's the ultimate playground.
Yeah, or you want personal branding or whatever, you want to fiddle with stuff, or you want to make your name in that community and all these things, Matt Mullenweg doesn't do too bad commercially, right?
They don't.
The guy who co-founded WordPress.
If I'm being honest, I got into open source because to me it was very punk rock. To me, like it was come as you are. There was no judgment. I got into music for community, and in technology, the one place you get kind of a similar sense of community is the open source world. Mm-hmm. If you think about it, they're literally giving up time, right? Which is the most precious resource we have, to contribute to something that's bigger than themselves. And that's why it's a weird topic to kind of talk about, because it really involves a certain type of individual that, I'm somebody that believes in civic duty, mm-hmm. right? I put a lot of, I volunteer a lot. The value system I grew up with is you always do for people that are below, right? Because I was there. I didn't come from a lot of money. To me, open source is liberation because it gives people access to the tools that used to be reserved for people that only had wealth. If you can't afford Microsoft Office, guess what? You've got LibreOffice, right? Is it as fancy as Word and Excel? Probably not, but it gets the job done.
As I said on this show, it's exactly that. Good enough is, per definition, good enough.
This is what I believe in. Knowledge is open source. People should not need thousands of dollars to get an education, to understand, to learn, and open. That's what's punk rock about it. It's that DIY. You and a $200 laptop can literally have access to the entire world's, the technical runtimes running. All of the technology that we all use and consume is readily available to anybody with a free GitHub account and a laptop.
That's awesome.
Anybody, right? If you've got the time and you just need a YouTube, like when I think about, I got a computer engineering degree, right? If I was probably around right now, would I have taken the same path? Probably not. Because everything that I learned in school, I can learn for free now. That's amazing, right? That is incredible. And I think that is what will ultimately save humanity, is access to knowledge, access to information. Now, can it fall into the hands of nefarious parties? Yeah, it can, but anything can. Yeah. If we use that as a limitation for us doing good, I don't think any good would ever get done. We just have to believe in humanity a bit more.
Oh, man, I really want to believe in humanity too, Avi. I think that's a really good point. And giving that global marketplace for knowledge, you said, that knowledge is open source. I can't argue with that. That is by definition true. But now let's take a look at actually making it work for companies. So talk to me about, what does it mean to have an open source project for a company? How does that differ from conventional projects that an organization might undertake? And what are the steps you go through to make that come to life?
So it's not only the open source projects in a company or sponsored by a company, but like we just said in the beginning, why would one start an open source project? Because I did that back in like 2007 or something, a project management tool with some strangers on the internet, So how do open source projects work? Whenever
I approach anything, I always think about the why, right? So I think the first step is, what problem are you solving? All right. Why would you start a new project? I always, and the first thing I would also say is, before you go and start a project, be sure to probe, Google, GitHub. Odds are, if you've thought of it, somebody else already has. So step one, check to see that there isn't already. You'll be surprised. Even some of the fringe ideas, people have thought about it. Again, that's the power of community. Somebody did go and think about it. But if it isn't there, right, and you realize, okay, so I have a unique answer to my why. This is important to the organization. We have to start an open source project, and it's for the right reason. You need to think about, from an enterprise standpoint, is there any concerns from a permissions view, an authority view, any of the code that you have, when you're determining, is it a good candidate for open source or a new project is for open source, you need to ensure that there's nothing proprietary, there's no commercial dependencies that tie into it. Where, if you think about it, if you have some of those dependencies, you'll be in a indefinite feedback loop for bug fixes and patches and features from those dependencies that go into your project. So try to, think about it from, how isolated can it be from any sort of dependencies on code that is commercial, that has the risk of not being maintained, right? Something that's going to go away. Try to think through like what that dependency framework looks like, and ensure that all of your code, right, is something that from an organization standpoint, you can put out for everyone's eyes to see. So house cleaning.
That's your product. And I wholeheartedly agree, Avi. There's also the question of, well, how do you run the project? And one book that I found really, really fascinating, and it's like, 10, 15 years old, is by a gentleman named Jono Bacon. I don't know if you've heard it. He wrote a book called The Art of Community. And it's obviously commercially available at your bookseller of choice, but it's also open source, published under Creative Commons license. So everybody who Googles it can download it. But he actually talks about how you set up the project itself, the people, right? The technology that you use, versioning control, the governance processes and all that stuff around it. And Avi, I'm pretty sure at Red Hat and MariaDB, you will have good IT hygiene processes in place, and it's not just free coding and Avi and his notepad saves the world.
You're 100% correct. And when you're talking about running it, right, and you're thinking like what you kind of described as a bit of kind of the governance, right, that kind of goes behind the promotion processes, what the release strategy is, the development priorities are, and something that not only maintains that level of transparency across, everybody involved in that project. So you're absolutely correct. There are formalized methods and conventions. That's a term that you guys should remember. There's definitely some discrete methods and conventions that apply to specific projects. So, you need to think about it from if you're launching something that's new, what are those technical processes? What are those standard release processes that you want? Schedule that stuff out, understand who the players are. I am a big believer in having, an agile, Scrum methodologies is how I've always delivered my projects, right? So I think there's a power in using those principles when building out that governance framework. But if you're launching your own, you get to decide what that is, right? You can look at the community, you can look at the governance models being used, you can look at the decision frameworks, and you don't have to reinvent the wheel, right? You can take some of those ideas and bring it into your organization and how you want to do that. I want to make sure I'm answering the questions correctly, right? Because there's, we're kind of talking about it from a planning and an execution standpoint, but there's also things to consider, like the infrastructure. Like you kind of hit on it earlier, right? What is your project repository going to be? Are they going to be GitHub or GitLab repos? Do you want to host your own repos with tools like Garrett? Those are some of the things that's going to differ from company to company. There's no right or wrong answer, but you do need to think about those things, right? Because you want to have things like bug and issue and feature tracking built into your general project and infrastructure planning, and it all kind of feeds into itself. But you need to kind of build out that scaffolding initially.
That makes a lot of sense. So we talk a little bit about, let's say you wanted to start an open source project or rely on open source for how you develop something that's your own secret sauce, or at least your own sauce. How do you differ in the way you implement software if you're looking to buy stuff that is based on open source versus buying and implementing software that is based on vendor proprietary code?
That's what's fascinating, right? Is it's literally the decision to make your source code available versus not. It's really that simple, because when I look at the commercial enterprises, and I've worked with plenty closed source companies, and I look at the way that their development cultures are, and I look at how look at something like Ansible, right? Huge open source project, and I look at how that's run. There's no difference. They follow the same methodologies. They follow all of the industry best practices from a development standpoint. It's if you wouldn't even know if one is closed or one's open source.
And that is because a lot of contributors to open source projects get what they're doing for a living. They might be programmers, and they just rinse and repeat in their free time what they do on the job. But I think the other part of the question that JM answered is, if I'm a regular firm, what's your baseline publishing or whatever? I think we were consulting before. Who cares? So what's your baseline publishing, and now I need to make up my decision. What's the software that I want to run my shop with? Is there a difference when it comes to the rollout between a commercial package and an open source package?
Great question. Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, there's some things that kind of stay the same, right? You're going to need marketing. You're going to need a lot of the types of awareness exercises that you would do for a commercial release. But the key differentiator is when you're putting out something that's open source, you're putting it out with the mindset of building a community behind it, right? So, when you roll this thing out, the intent should be that this is available, free to use free to dissect and learn and analyze and contribute from others. That is a key differentiator, because when you roll out a commercial product, you're not thinking about community. You're just thinking about buyers, right? You're thinking about customers consuming your product and giving you dollars for it. In the case of open source, you're thinking about, who's going to be my community manager, right? Who are going to be the community advocates? What is the change management looking like and governance looking like for an entire community? What are the best practices and guidelines for those communities, right? You mentioned Drupal earlier, right? Think about all the Drupal meetups that they would do when they first started, right?
Yeah, the Drupal cons.
Yes, the Drupal cons, right? Yeah. So you're kind of building a kind of local ecosystem, but it's global. And what I mean by that, each city that's consuming certain tool, like, again, I kind of revert back to what I think about my Red Hat days, right? Red Hat would have in almost every major city I could think of, they would have like a monthly get together, and they would call it Red Hat user group, and it would be free. And what I loved about what Red Hat did is they would come with free swag, right? And anybody that's using the open source versions of our enterprise tools, we would give free shirts to and stickers to, and sometimes the people that are working on the commercial versions of it would actually be in attendance, and they would share ideas, and it was just it's a beautiful thing, right? And that was kind of the convergence of commercial and open source coming together, right? And all kind of feeding into the same community. But those are the types of things that you want to think about, right? You're thinking about community during your rollout. That's the one differentiating thing that you don't think about when you're putting out a commercial product.
I think it's so interesting to hear you talk about community. And I feel like that's a mindset shift, The open source way, it feels like it has wide reaching sort of tendrils beyond just software development. Where do you see the open source way affecting different parts of an organization, that mindset leading to different ways of business practice?
Open source to me is liberation, right? Open source to me is a way of life. It's a culture. You know, at least in my view, the greatest byproduct of being a part of an open source community, or thinking in that paradigm, is kind of the sense of, you know, you're going to be building an environment, a company, a company culture of people that have a civic sense, right? Have a sense of doing and contributing to things that serve more than just yourself, right? I think in a time like the time that we live in right now, that is very important. And I think it is something that will provide benefits to companies and organizations that embrace and attract the type of talent that think in that way, because it's we're in this together mindset, right? And that's that's the intent and motivation behind open source. That to me is so critical. And if the people that don't necessarily share that value system, because I mean, I think at the end of the day, it is a value system, right? It's an ideal that you feel goes back to something that we started the second section on. Knowledge is open source. Knowledge is available to everyone. Everyone should be given the tools and the at least the opportunities to learn and achieve what all of us are so fortunate to have, right? And I think that's an important ideal.
And I agree with you that I think we, in our current times, don't have enough of that mutual understanding of that. Yeah, we're in the same boat here. But maybe as a last question for you, Avi, where do you see the future of the open source?
See, I see open source not being confined to just software, right? That's why I wanted to start that's why I wanted to start with, I use kind of the example of a hit, the longest running #1 song in history was built off an open source music license. You're going to start seeing these types of things occur more. I think about, I really think everyone should check out this thing called it's like the Open Architecture Network. It is a fascinating window into the possibilities of what open source can be. It was one architect that decided everyone should have the ability to construct, a building that provides them, a low carbon footprint, that is a sustainable way for our environment. It shouldn't be limited to people that just have money, right? And he made all of those blueprints available, and other architects joined on, right? Imagine if that applied to just about everything. Think about, hearing. I heard that hearing aids are no longer you're not going to require prescription for them. So think about with 3D printing technology, right, where it's going. When these things end up becoming available to everyone, people will be able to build actual devices using, all of the open source tools that they have. A company that I thought was doing something very interesting, Nike, right? Nike, most people don't think about Nike as a big open source company, but they really embrace open source. And, they're working on technology that will allow, people to use, these little devices to map their shoe, build out custom shoes, and then you'll have these custom Nikes or Jordans that you like built to your dimensions, right? Custom just for you, with a 3D printer. Like the possibilities are like limitless. And I think the freedom to do and explore these things, the only way you get there is from embracing kind of the open source ideals.
Yeah, and just to close it out, one example which has failed, right, in full disclosure, but one example was, for example, the idea of bringing open source spirit into politics. And in Sweden in the 2010s, they founded the Pirate Party. They literally had a pirate ship as their logo. And it spread through Europe, where you had Pirate Party representatives in the local parliaments and all that stuff. And their idea was, we do everything completely in the open, and they're using open source technology to do discussions and all these things.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, reality kicks in. If you're a single issue party, society is more complex, and they failed on that. But I thought that was a really nice experiment.
But see what I mean about it being punk rock? That is a punk rock thing, right? And I love that they were able to do that. It's great.
Agreed. Yep.
Well, I think this is a really good point for us to cap off today's conversation. I have to say it's been truly fascinating, and we're going to leave our viewers, who I'm sure are thinking about tons of stuff already, with a couple of different questions as we go to our second and final music break for the episode, where we call you to action here. Think about your future. So what ideas do you have that might fit into an open source development effort? What might be useful in your daily work if you were to change something in the way in which the software that you use works? And how could you contribute to a larger context around that? And then where do you think open source might fit into your organization, its product stack, its services, and how it goes to business? So we'll leave you for a couple of minutes, and we'll come right back with the conclusions of the episode and a farewell.
And be loved in return.
All right. This was, as always, awesome music from our friend Jeremy Volz, who graciously open sourced to us his music that we can use it. And we're very appreciative of this, Jeremy, if you listen to this episode. But I think this was a fascinating conversation that we had with Avi about open source and all those ideas behind it. And I will ask JM after the recording if he is now a convert to open source software. But it was way too much to summarize this. But the one takeaway that I have is that open source is punk rock. So that's my takeaway from this episode. Avi, thanks for this little snippet.
I love it.
I'm going to use it forever going on forward.
I love it.
Maybe more importantly, now that our listeners have listened to the last hour that we spoke about open source, everybody has that burning question. How do I get into contact with this very smart individual?
Well, I am an open book, and I'm always excited to meet and collaborate and partner with new people. So you can find me on LinkedIn, which seems to be business Facebook for everyone. But I feel like that's probably the greatest way to kind of get in touch with me. Drop me a line. I'm very approachable. So I'd love to meet you.
We have lots of links that we're going to put in the show notes, and all the sorts of things you're going to find at whatsyourbaseline.com. And of course, that brings us to the end of this episode. Thank you for listening in. Thank you for loving what we do, liking and sharing. Please keep spreading the word about What's Your Baseline. We've got hundreds of followers here on LinkedIn. And if you can get more people involved and give us some great feedback, we can continue to produce amazing content with great people like Avi to come in and give us perspectives we would not normally be able to access from where we are. Please go to whatsyourbaseline.com, particularly for this episode, whatsyourbaseline.com/episode 29 for the specifics of what we talked about, as well as the links we've mentioned in the show. But until next time, friends, I'm J.M. Erlinson.
I'm Avi Ghosh.
I'm Roland Wold.
And we'll see you in the next one.